Hi guys! Thank you for joining and welcome to this channel. And we have quite an essential topic to talk about today. And this topic emerged from numerous questions and requests we've been getting on social media.
And whether you're a newcomer or moved to a new city in Canada, we all will eventually have to look for an apartment. And this experience can be frustrating and intimidating, especially if you don't have any insight into how the system works.
And this is exactly why we decided to make a video about how to rent an apartment in Canada. And in this video we're going to talk about what to expect from the rental process, share some life hacks and tips for you to find the perfect place and help you make the best out of the process. And we will talk about some rules and regulations for you to know as a tenant.
Yeah, and if you're new to this channel, my name is Anastasia.
And I'm Anna.
And we are Russian immigrants living here in Canada. And on this channel we share practical advice about moving to a new country and show you how we build our life after immigration.
Yeah, let's get started. Let's talk about how to find a new home for you.
First, let's start with the things that you need to get ready before you consider applying for the apartments of your dreams. It is important to have everything ready in place before you apply for the apartment that you really want, so that your future landlord can make a decision really quickly and you can get a response fast. I only say that because in large cities like Toronto, the competition for great apartments and great prices and deals is so fierce that you gotta be quick, you gotta be ready, and you have to act fast. Let's start with what landlords typically ask when you apply for an apartment. So they want to see a reference letter from your previous landlords, they want to see a letter of employment, they also want to see your credit report and credit score, and also they will ask for a deposit of the first and the last month's rent. Please note that this is a list of all the necessary items if you're applying to rent an apartment in Toronto, Ontario. But cities like Toronto or Vancouver are fiercely competitive. However, smaller cities like Montreal or maybe Calgary will not ask for all of those things. They might not ask you for the letter of employment, or you won't have to provide the last month of payment. You'll only be able to get away with just the first month of payment. So let's talk about each point in more details, and I'm going to start with references. In Canada, references play a big role in whether you're trying to get a job, rent an apartment, or even get a pet. People want to know they can trust you, and the easiest way to find out is to ask your previous landlord about how amazing as a tenant you are. Do you pay your rent on time? Do you make noise? Do you paint your walls in colors that are too funky to handle? Usually, you'd need to provide names and contact information of one or two people who are your previous landlords. If you're new to Canada, it might be tricky to get a reference, although not impossible. When I moved out of my parents' apartment, I used my mom as a reference. Another life hack is, which Anna actually told me about because she used it just a couple of months ago or maybe a year ago. Anyways, so what she did when she was new to Canada, she rented an Airbnb in the very beginning. And when she was applying for her new apartment to rent, she used her Airbnb host as a reference. If you know anyone in Canada, either friends or your employer, you can ask them to provide a reference for you too. You just gotta be transparent with your landlord that they're your colleagues or friends. Next goes letter of employment. Your new landlord or your property manager wants to make sure that you're able to pay your rent on a regular basis. What they'll do is they'll ask you for your letter of employment to confirm that you have a stable income and are making enough money to afford paying rent along with utilities and other living expenses. This is done because the rental board regulations are heavily skewed to protect the tenant. So landlords are very concerned with making sure that they're signing up for a reasonable and responsible tenant that will pay rent on time and will not destroy their apartment. And if you're new to Canada and don't have a job yet, it might be really tricky to rent an apartment, especially in a big city like Toronto. However, it's possible that you may have just accepted a job but haven't started it yet. In this case, you can just provide your job offer to the landlord and that will suffice. I did just that when I moved to Toronto. Another thing that landlords may be open to if you don't have a letter of employment or references is if you're able to pay several months of rent upfront in cash. And that works for many newcomers, and that typically just generally works for many people because, well, money rules the world. Do keep in mind that if you're renting in Ontario, your landlords actually cannot ask for a full year of rental payments upfront. A few weeks ago, we published a video about credit score and credit history in Canada, and we mentioned that it's important for you to have to be able to rent an apartment in Canada. Just like with a letter of employment, your landlord wants to see your credit score to make sure that you're reliable and you pay your bills regularly. Your landlord can ask you to provide your full credit report, or they can ask you to give them permission to do a credit inquiry on your name. If you don't have any credit history in Canada, it might be challenging. However, if you're able to offer several months of rent upfront in cash to the landlord, that might work for them. And last but not least, when you rent your apartment, your landlord will ask you to provide a deposit of the first and last month of rent. This payment will apply for your first and your last month of rent respectively. Most landlords will require it to be a certified check or a bank draft. You can get either one at any branch of your bank. This is something that's important to remember, because if you're looking for an apartment and you're paying, let's say, $1,000 a month, it actually means that you need to have $2,000 ready up front to secure your lease and apartment. In cities with big rental competition, landlords prefer serious applicants only, so they will often not even consider applications who do not provide a deposit right away with their application. Now, even if you have all of that ready, this does not guarantee you will get the apartment that you really want. In cities like Toronto or Vancouver, the competition is very high, so getting a good apartment at a cheap price is very hard. There may be dozens of applications for a single apartment, and landlords are in a position to choose which tenant they prefer the most. In order to compete with that, what happens in such cases is that potential tenants bid on the apartments, oftentimes offering more than the initial asking price. Some landlords might even want to meet you in person and talk to you and get to know you so that they can make their own judgment call on whether they would like for you to live in their apartment.
Okay, before we move on, let's make sure we cover the topic of what to do if you're new to Canada. It might be hard to secure an apartment if you've never met a landlord, or you've never had a rental history, or you've never had a credit history, and you don't have a job in Canada, and so on. And all that Anastasia has just talked about sounds very demanding, so we've prepared some alternative temporary options for you to choose from. Usually you have the following alternative options: Airbnb, hotels, or friends and family. Out of all those options, staying with your friends or family would be the best. If you know someone who's already in Canada, ask them if you could stay with them for a couple of weeks after you arrive. They can also show you around and help you during your first couple of weeks, so you won't feel completely lost, and they will support you. Hotel is an option too, but it would be the most expensive option. At the same time, it's the most comfortable, so you don't have to worry about anything but finding your new home. I think Airbnb is the best of all worlds. For those of you not familiar with it, it's an online platform where you can rent a room or an apartment or a whole house directly from someone else who has some space to share. Let's say I have an apartment and one bedroom is empty. I can rent it out to people to earn some money, and people can stay in that room. The price you pay is significantly less than a hotel room, especially if you land in smaller cities. Okay, now let's talk briefly about different types of homes that you can rent in Canada. When you begin your search, you should specify the type of home you're looking for to narrow down your search, and different types of home will be priced differently, and they come with different pros and cons. Apartment buildings. All apartments in such buildings are typically rented, owned and managed by one property management versus a bunch of individual owners. Those apartment buildings usually date back several decades, and there aren't as many in Toronto. There are still some older quality buildings out there that have vacancies periodically. The good thing about apartment buildings owned by property managements is that the rent is controlled by the province. It means that you won't see a hike in rental price year after year. Another type you can choose is houses. Some homeowners have converted part of their home into a separate apartment or two, or decide to rent out their entire house. The biggest advantage of renting a house is the opportunity to live in a residential neighborhood, often with private outdoor space and sometimes even parking. It's best for large families, or if you have a beautiful big dog. The most popular part of a house is to rent out basement. And here we get to the option of basement room or basement apartment. So I've just mentioned that some homeowners convert their basements into a place to rent out. But don't be shocked. Basements have windows and often only partially below the ground level. Advantages of renting a basement is that it's usually cheaper. You can rent a whole basement apartment for the price of a small room in a condo downtown. And you also get perks that I mentioned previously, like peace and quiet of residential neighborhood, outdoor space and parking. Disadvantages would be noise from upstairs, lack of sunlight and humidity. Even newly renovated basement apartments sometimes are cold and humid, especially during winter. Last but not least, condos. Big cities like Toronto or Vancouver have many condos in downtown area. Many of those buildings are owned by individual investors who rent them out. Renting a condo allows you to take advantage of some of the city's best locations, and many of such buildings have amenities like gyms, pools, concierge services or party rooms, and they are usually close to public transit. If you decide to rent a condo, you'll be renting directly from the unit's owner, but will be required to abide by the condominium's rules. Your landlord may also choose to impose additional rules based on their preferences. For instance, they won't allow for pets, may restrict the times you can do laundry, or just restrict you from making additional holes on the walls for shelves or paintings.
Alright, so now that you know what you need to get ready for your rental application, and you also know what kind of home you'll be looking for, it's time to talk about where and how you'll be looking for your new home. And there's a few tools that you will use. You can use a number of different rental websites to build a list of the properties you like and want to see. You can find a realtor to help you walk you through the process, or you can ask around to see if any of your friends are renting out an apartment. And always make sure to walk around in the neighborhoods where you're planning to rent an apartment so that you know what to expect. So let's dive into each one of those points a little bit deeper. There are plenty of websites where you can start. My personal favorite is condos.ca. This website has a good level of information and it's easy to use and navigate around. I would select my criteria and use the map view to find available apartments in the areas that interest me. You can also set up email notifications for whenever the home matching your criteria goes on sale. This will allow you to stay on top of every single property on the market and get that awesome apartment first, before anyone else will. Now, before you start visiting apartments, make sure you find a realtor, especially if you're in a big city like Toronto or Vancouver. Real estate agents typically work for both rental and property sale markets. And unlike the popular belief, you don't need to pay to a realtor to help you find an apartment. The way the real estate rental compensation works is that they get a commission for every single property that they rent, and that commission is paid to them by the landlord who had succeeded to rent their own apartment. The commission of a realtor would typically be equal to one single month of rent. And if a realtor works with another realtor that represents the landlord, those two will split the commission. So for you as a tenant, working with a realtor is free and comes with a lot of upside. They know the market, so they can give you pointers on where to look, how to inspect the apartment, and what to avoid. They also know all the regulations, so they will make sure that your landlord doesn't screw you over by adding unjust conditions on the lease or asking for deposits that they're not allowed to ask for. Also, having your realtor represent you also gives you a level of credibility, which will increase your chances of getting an apartment you really want if competition is high. To get the full list of all the different websites where you can look for your new home, don't forget to check the description below. I'll add some of the most useful links in there. You can also ask around. Ask your friends or friends of friends. Maybe someone is renting out an apartment, or maybe someone wants to move out of their own apartment and they're looking for someone to sublet it. A sublet is when you're taking over someone else's rental contract and they want to move out sooner than their contract end date. For example, my friend wants to move in with his girlfriend sooner, but his rental contract ends within 4 months from now. So what we do is we sign a sublet agreement, and I'll be living in his apartment for the remaining 4 months instead of him, and I'll be paying rent and utilities as per the original rent contract. That way, I get a place for 4 months and he doesn't have to pay penalties for quitting his contract. And the last thing I want to mention is, make sure that you discover the neighborhoods where you're thinking about living. Just take a stroll, walk around the neighborhood, check out the buildings that you potentially like, walk into those buildings and see if there's any apartments for rent. You never know what's available. I think it's a very important thing to do to explore your neighborhoods and to make sure that the neighborhood is a good fit for the lifestyle you want to have. because in the end of the day, you'll be living there for 12 months and you want to make sure that you have everything you need for your everyday life. And before we move on to the next topics, I want to mention that Anna and I are planning on making a series of videos discovering different neighborhoods in Toronto. So if you're curious to learn more about which neighborhood is going to be the best fit for you when you move to Canada, please stay tuned and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to make sure that you know exactly when that video comes out.
Let's talk about rental prices. If you're planning to rent, you should know what to expect to pay for your rent. Canada is huge, and so is the price range in different cities. I suggest you use numbeo.com to see how much renting apartments costs in different cities in Canada. But if you go to one of the websites Anastasia mentioned before to look for an apartment, you'll get the gist of price range in the area you're interested in. And you'll see the difference in apartments themselves just by looking at the pictures. COVID played a big role in price drop in Toronto downtown, since most people decided to take advantage of remote work and left this big expensive city in favor of smaller, cheaper places. However, interestingly, in Montreal prices went up. And don't forget about utilities. You will see what's included in your rent, but depending on the landlord, you might have to pay for utilities extra, like heating or hydro. That's what we call electricity here. Some landlords decide to pay for heating themselves, so you will have to pay for electricity only. It all depends on case-by-case basis. Some newer buildings in Toronto have Wi-Fi included in the original rental price these days. It's also important to note that more and more landlords these days ask for home insurance, especially in new buildings. It means that once you sign your lease, you will have to provide a proof of home insurance for the entire time of your lease. You will not be able to get your keys without that. And the average minimum price of home insurance per month is about $20 to $30. Speaking of newer buildings, it's becoming more and more popular to ask for key deposit, which is about $200, in case you lose or damage your key. You will be given this money back once your lease is over and you return your keys. Please note that you're entitled to interest to be paid to you on this amount of money, unless stated otherwise in your lease agreement.
And last but not least, let's talk about your rights and obligations as a tenant. Even though we recommend you go with a realtor as you embark on your apartment hunting journey, we think it's really important to know your rights personally. So let's say you found the apartment you're looking for. Now, in Canada, the typical lease duration is 12 months. What this means is that whenever you're moving into a new apartment, you have to make a contract for 12 months straight. Whenever the 12 months expires, in some provinces, your contract automatically moves into a month-to-month basis, meaning that you're kind of renewing your lease every single month. In Quebec, however, once your 12 months contract expires, you have to renew it for another 12 months. So depending on what your living preferences are, be careful choosing the province you want to live in. The lease contract you sign contains all the rights and responsibilities for both you and your landlord. Make sure you read your contract carefully and make sure to ask your realtor for any of the things that you don't understand before signing it. If you decide to move out once your lease ends, you have to give a 60 to 90-day notice to your landlord telling them that you want to move out. And you have to do that despite and regardless of the fact that your lease is ending, because if you don't notify your landlord that you will be moving out in the end of your contract will automatically renew. So you must be wondering what happens if you suddenly want to break your contract and move out before your 12 months expires. Well, breaking your lease prematurely will come with some penalties for you. That is because you've signed a contract and you're legally required to pay for 12 months of rent. However, what you can do is sublet your apartment to someone else who will become your subtenant. In some cases, you and your landlord can mutually agree to break the lease earlier, but that won't happen too often. If they decide to let your initial lease expire, your subtenant will have to pay rent to you while you will still have to pay rent to your landlord. Please keep in mind that in this case, you will still be responsible for your apartment, even if your subtenant does something wrong. In Ontario, the Landlord and Tenant Board regulates cases in which you can end your contract sooner. If you have an argument or an issue with the landlord and you think you have a serious reason to end your contract sooner, you can contact the board and try to resolve this case with them. We will leave the link to their website below. If you do decide to sublease your apartment to someone else, keep in mind that you cannot charge rent higher than the one stated in your initial lease contract by your landlord. Another thing to keep in mind is that subleasing an apartment can be risky. If your subtenant fails to pay rent or damages your property, you're the one responsible for it. Alright, so before we sum everything up, let's talk about some of the most common and basic rules and regulations to be aware of. First, let's talk about pets, our very furry friends. If you decide to get a pet, your landlord cannot evict you for having a pet. However, they can refuse signing a lease with you if you have a pet and if they have a no-pet policy. If you're renting a condo and then you decide to get a pet, keep in mind that the condominium rules take precedence to the Residential Tenancies Act, which means that if the condo does not allow pets, your furry friend might get evicted. Another important thing to keep in mind is rental price increases. In Ontario, rent increases are controlled, but this rule does not apply for buildings that are younger than 20 years. Generally speaking, unless it's the 20-year-old or less building, the landlords are only allowed to increase your rent every 12 months by the amount no more than the Consumer Price Index, which is typically 2 to 3% per year. Generally, because the landlord owns the property you're renting, the landlord is allowed to enter your property at any time. However, because you're renting it out, they're supposed to ask for permission to enter your property at least 24 hours in advance before they actually do that. Also, your landlord should be allowed to do some visits into your apartment if you decide to move out. And again, they are expected to give a 24-hour notice before they show up. Another common question that we stumbled upon in our research is what happens if the landlord sells the apartment that you're renting? Well, the landlord cannot evict you if they decide to sell a unit to someone else. If you have a valid contract, you're allowed to stay at the apartment until the end of your lease, and maybe even extend your lease if you wish so. The only reason at which you might be required to leave the apartment if the new owner wants to move in that apartment themselves, or they want their family member moved in. Another thing is that if you're a month-to-month tenant, the landlord is allowed to give you a 60-day notice to move into the apartment, provided it's going to be them or their family member.
So before we finish, let's sum it up. To get the place you want, you should have the following. Have your deposit ready for the first and last month's rent. Prepare your references. Get a confirmation of employment letter. And don't forget to make copies in case you don't get the first place you apply for. Do a credit check on yourself and have it ready to provide to prospective landlord. You can order one online at Equifax or TransUnion. There are also some other things to keep in mind. Don't forget to scope out Toronto neighborhoods. Make sure you find a neighborhood that fits your lifestyle. Be flexible. It's not easy or cheap to find rentals in Toronto, for example. Keep an open mind and be prepared to make compromises. You won't likely get location, size, cheap rent, amazing view at the same time. Be ready to make a quick decision. The Toronto rental market is very competitive. If you find a place you like, realize that if you take the night to think about it, it'll be probably gone tomorrow. Don't lie on your application. While it might be tempting to make yourself look like a better tenant, having a friendly relationship with your landlord will pay off in the long run.
And that's it, guys. Thank you for watching. If this video was helpful for you, or we helped you land the apartment of your dreams, please leave a comment below, like our video, and consider subscribing to our channel. It's going to help us and motivate us immensely.
And if you have any questions or useful information to share, please don't be shy and drop us a comment below. Or you can also send us an email or follow us on Instagram.
And that's it, guys. See you in the next video. Bye, friends.
Take care.